The courts of the Mughals and the various regions were in vernacular, that is, using the mother tongue. The merchant's tongue, that's between 1600 and 1757. With the Charter of the East India Company in 1600, the English arrived as a language of commerce. The factors language in early factories trading posts like Surat, Madras, and Kolkata, as it was known as Calcutta, English was used solely for ledger books and business correspondence. The interpreters, the British were forced to learn local languages, to rely on the bashas, that's the interpreters, who spoke in a pidgin English. At this stage, there was no intent to spread the language. It was a tool for profit. So, class, today we're going to keep it simple, structured, and meaningful so you understand what it matters, why this matters, and not just the facts. What does this topic mean? We're going to have an overview of the period between 1600 to 1857. What does this topic mean? The pre-transportation phase, an overview of this period. So, we're keeping it very simple as I mentioned before. The part of your syllabus explains how the English came to India not just as a language but through history, trade, power, and education. It connects literature, history, and culture. So, students don't just learn English, they understand why English became important in India. It shows why is it important to learn how India moved from trade to colonization, and it helps us to understand the modern education system and explains why English is still widely used in India today. It builds awareness of history plus the identity. In simple words, we learn this to understand how the past shaped our present. An overview of the period of 1600 to 1857, which marks this period marks rise of the British power, the spread of English education, and ends with the Indian Rebellion of 1857. It begins with trade and ends with resistance. Sea route discovery, which happened in 1498. Vasco da Gama discovered the sea route to India in 1498. They landed in Calicut. This opened India to European trade and influence. What is the East India Company? The East India Company was formed in 1600. Why was it formed? To trade spices, silk, cotton, etc. To compete with Portuguese and Dutch traders. What is charter? Given in 1600, given by Queen Elizabeth. It allowed the company exclusive rights to trade with East. The charter, which equals to the official permission to trade. Why did the Mughals allow trade in Bengal in 1651? Mughals rulers wanted revenue, foreign goods, and the English appeared as traders, not as rulers. So far, they allowed to set up factories, trading posts. Why did the Europeans first land on the west coast? Places like Goa and Calicut were easy to access by sea. Important spices trade centers. The west coast was the gateway to India. Why did the English power grow around 1688 because there was a strong navy, better trade organization, and the decline of the Mughal Empire, which is the victory in the European conflicts like the Glorious Revolution, strengthened England, and slowly the trade became rulers. How did the Calcutta develop? The company got zamindari land rights of three villages: Satunuti, Govindpur, and Kalikata. Built Fort William. This area became Calcutta. What is Calcutta Madrasa? Founded by in 1781 by Warren Hastings. The purpose was to promote Islamic law and learning, train administrators. The early step in the modern education in India. That was what was the Kolkata Madrasa. Who is Charles Grant? So now I'm giving you, like I've mentioned before, it's an overview of the period. Charles Grant was a strong supporter of English education, the Christian moral values. He believed English education would improve Indian society. So we come across all these names like William Carey. Who is William Carey? The contributions he made, he promoted education, translated the Bible into many languages, Indian languages, and also helped in printing and language development. He is known as the pioneer of modern education and printing in India. A simple way you can we can talk about it is English did not come to India just as a language. It came through ships, trade, power, and education. Understanding this journey helps us to understand our own identity today. Let me take you through the period. Now we have Cowley's minute, which is in 1.3. Talking about 1498, the discovery of the sea route by India to India by Vasco da Gama, which happened in 1498, and 1600 was the East India Company was formed. The charter was formed, and the East India Company it acquired the Madrasa on lease from the native Indian ruler. And the East India Company was persisted by the Mughal rulers to trade at the Hooghly in Bengal in 1651. And in 1668, the East India Company acquired Bombay from Portugal, and Bombay became the central for trade and west coast of the Indian subcontinent. Well, as we know, ladies and gentlemen, we are going through the period between 1600 and 1857. We know that the Aryans came to India and settled. The Aryans in 1600 to 1813, the Aryans came to India and settled down in the Indian subcontinent. They were settlers, not colonizers. Now, there are differences between settlers and colonizers. Settlers refer to the individuals who establish permanent settlements and displace population, ingenious populations, whereas colonizers can refer to a broader concept of denomination, of domination and control over a territory and its people. The Indo-Aryan languages like Sanskrit are also associated with the Indo-Aryan migrations into the Indian subcontinent, bringing them their language and their cultural traditions. Sanskrit became the most important language of ancient India. So, Sanskrit is also considered the root of many Indo-Aryan languages, including Hindi, Bengali, Gujarati, Marathi, and Punjabi, which share vocabulary as grammar and syntax with it. Muslims first arrived in the Indian subcontinent via trade routes and conquest. Over the years, Mughal Empire was established through the Arab conquest of Sindh, the Persian language, which is the lingua franca, a language that is adopted as a common language between the speakers whose native languages are different of the Indian subcontinent, and a widely used official language in the northern Indian Persian, so specifically the Old Persian is an ancestor of several languages, including modern Persian, Farsi, Dari, spoken in Afghanistan and Tajikistan, which Tajik also having a significant influence on languages and Urdu, Hindi, and Indo-Aryan languages. So the pre-transportation in 1498, Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese explorer, arrived in Calicut, India, and he became the first European to reach India by sailing around Africa, thus discovering the route to India, which initiated the advent of Europeans. Indigenous education system in the pre-colonial India, that is before British rule, the indigenous means originating from a particular place. Traditional learning centers, India had a rich educational heritage with gurukuls. Gurukul, which refers to the traditional Indian residential school system where students live with and learn from their guru, that is the teacher, which emphasizing holistic education and spiritual development. There were pathshalas, that is schools, and madrasas, which is an Arabic word, place of learning or school. Ananda Buddhist Viharas, that's Ananda Buddha Vihara, which refers to the Buddhist temple or monastery. Subjects taught were Sanskrit, Persian, Arabic, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, philosophy, and common practical skills like carpentry, weaving, and agriculture were passed down through the communities. Access to education, predominantly accessible to higher castes and affluent families. Caste, gender, and religious restrictions often excluded the marginalized groups. Evaluation methods, no formal exams. Learning was based on the understanding and spiritual growth. So, thus, the education of English language and education in India. Now, we're going to learn about the initial contact in the year 1498 to 1600, where the Portuguese, you have already mentioned before, is set stage, the Europeans arriving, Vasco da Gama arriving at Portugal, and is set stage for the European competition for the next century. English was virtually unheard of in the subcontinent, and the linguistic landscape was dominated by the Persian, the court language for Mughals, and various regional vernaculars. So the factories language, as we have mentioned before, is the factories language, is the tradition, Surat, the factors language. In fact, early factories trading posts like Surat, Madras and Calcutta English was used solely for ledger books and for business correspondence. The interpreters, British were forced to learn local languages and rely on the bhashas, that is, the interpreters who spoke as pidgin English, the at a language where there is no where there is no intent to spread the language. It was a tool of profit. So, like we know already, that Vasco da Gama arrived in Portugal and has set the stage for the European competition for the next century. English was virtually unheard of in the subcontinent. The linguistic landscape was dominated by Persian, the court language of the Mughals. Then we also know about the various regional vernaculars which they learned in their own mother tongue. The merchant's language, the Charter Act in the East India Company in 1600 English arrived as a language of commerce, the factors language. The factors language, as we know, in early factories, the trading posts like Surat, Madras, and Calcutta, English was used solely for ledger books and business correspondence. The interpreters, we've already mentioned about it, that they were using pidgin English and there was no intent to spread the language. The road to institutionalization, which happened between 1813 to 1833. Now, the Charter Act, the renewal refers to on page 2.5. To page 2.5. The use of English during this period. The Charter Act, the British government submitted the resolutions in the House of Commons for 20 years period, providing the renewal of East India Company's charter included provisions forcing them to promote education and scientific knowledge, religious and moral improvement to Indians, who also argued to work against the Hindu superstitions and cruelty in India of Hindu, allocating 1 lakh of rupees, 10,000 pounds for annually for the revival of the improvement of English language or English literature, allowing the Christian missionaries to enter and preach. Some showed interest and some showed interest and some interest in education if Indians. The Charter Acts, which renewed the East India Company's charter, were passed approximately every 20 years, with notable acts occurring in 1793, 1813, 1833, and 1853. So let's go through it, which is happening in 1793. Okay, so between 1791, that is Banaras Sanskrit was established. 1794, William Carey, as an English missionary, which started his first school in Bengal with Bengali as a medium of instruction. Charles Grant in 1797 began to persuade the East India Company and the Parliament to impart English education to Indians. And Tipu Sultan dies in the battle in 1799, and Mysore was conquered by the East India Company. In 1813, the Charter Act renewal, where the education was made the responsibility of the East India Company, and the East India Company brought under the control of the British Parliament by the Pitt's India Act in 1784. The Bombay Natives Education Society was set up under the Ethelstone patronage in 1815. In 1821, Sanskrit College, Pune was established. In 1829, the college at Delhi was established for Oriental learning. In 1833, English was introduced as a subject in Agra College and Kolkata Madrasa due to the demand of some Indians. District English schools were set up in Delhi and Banaras. In 1835, Macaulay's Minute of Education became the blueprint for English education in India. As we are going to study about it bit by bit, we will be coming to it. And also, let us talk about 1772. Warren Hastings was the Governor General in Bengal and he patronized Hindu Muslim learning in Bengal. Mass education in English was considered impractical. However, the big cities and middle and upper classes won the favor with the court and promised cheap native labor. Due to this, the trade contracts with the British with some Indian picked up English as a part of social interaction. The specimen showed that their competence in English was quite acceptable. So now coming on to during these 2 decades, a fierce debate erupted between the British English with the British administration regarding the direction of Indian education. People like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, the rise of Indian intelligentsia, the influential Indians, most notably Rajaram Mohan Roy, began camping for English education. They viewed it as a gateway to Western science, philosophy, and political ideas that could modernize Indian society, an administrative necessity. As the British Empire grew, it became too expensive to staff and every clerical position with the Englishmen. The East India Company needed a class of English speaking and Indians to serve as a cheap backbone to the colonial bureaucracy. So in 1833, the turning point, the Charter Act of 1833 removed the restrictions of the European settlement and the uniform solidified need for a uniform. Okay, now talking about the administrative necessity and the turning point. Now, the administrative necessity, as the British Empire grew, it became very expensive to staff every clerical position with the ungallant Englishmen. The East India Company needed a class of English speaking Indians to serve as the cheap backbone of the colonial bureaucracy. In 1833, the turning point, the Charter Act of 1833 removed the restrictions of the European settlement and solidified the need for a uniform administrative language paved the way for the famous Macaulay's Minute, which happened in 1835 and ended the debate by declaring that a single shelf of the good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. So that was the turning point where it was announced by Macaulay, Babington Macaulay, that the single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. That was the kind of impression he had about India. Now, talking about, let's go down to the key drivers. The key drivers of the expansion. The movement to formalize English education was published by three distinct groups that are often referred to as the three pillars of English shift. Let us continue. The rise of the English intelligentsia, and this was a turning point. Now let's come to the next slide. Yeah. Now coming on to Macaulay's Minute in 1835. Please refer your books to page number, the use of English during this period. And now talking about the Charter Act which happened, and now we're talking about Macaulay's Minute, which is on 1.3 on page 4. Macaulay's Minute. Macaulay's Minute. The Christian missionaries were active in the 18th century and their main aim was the conversion. So, the most significant document in the history of English education in India was prepared by Macaulay's Minute, Thomas Babington Macaulay, who sought to resolve the Orientalist Anglican controversy, a debate over whether the British should fund traditional Indian learning or Western education. Macaulay famously proposed creating a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but British in tastes, in opinions, morals, and intellect. This led to the English Education Act of 1835, which was officially redirected educational funding towards the Western curriculum taught in English. Now, coming on to the Wood's Dispatch. Dispatch, which happened in 1854, it's also called the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta. If Macaulay provided the philosophy, Sir Charles Wood provided the stature or the structure of it. Wood's Dispatch, which created the organized educational hierarchy that exists in similar form today. Primary schools, that's the vernacular, the local languages were taught at the village level. The high schools, the vernacular, Anglo vernacular mixed languages were taught in the high schools. And in colleges and universities, India became the English became the sole medium of instructions. This led to the establishment of the first three major universities in India in 1857, that's Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. The down filtration theory, which is what is the down filtration theory? The British initially followed the downward filtration theory. They believed that the educating the upper middle and middle class in English, Western culture, and refined ideas would naturally filter down to the masses. I repeat, the British initially followed the downward filtration theory, which they believed that by educating the upper and middle classes in English, the Western culture and refined ideas would naturally filter down to the masses. So they expected that they're going to teach only some part, the highly intellectual people English, the Indians or the people of our country. So that's how these would be teaching the masses, and that's how it gets filtered down to the masses, the education and the language. However, this failed largely due to due to the education, the general public, instead of creating a massive cultural and linguistic divide between the English educated elite and the rest of the population. So, because of this divide, it failed very badly. The massive cultural and linguistic um, divide. This happened, and the education system has failed. And the rest of the population had gone through it, which was a difficult situation for Indians to go through. The Indian universities, the Act of 1904, was a landmark piece of legislation which was introduced through the Viceroyalty of Lord Curzon. While it aimed to reform and elevate the standards of higher education, it became one of the most controversial acts of colonial era due to the political undertones. Why was it introduced? So, by the turn of the 20th century, the British became wary of the growing nationalist sentiment in India. Many of the leaders of the independence movement were products of the university system established by Wood's Dispatch. And we know that Wood's Dispatch was also the and the Curzon believed that the universities had become factories producing political revolutionaries. The qualities of education had declined due to the focus on rote learning and exams rather than research. So the private colleges were poorly managed and this lacked discipline. To address, he appointed the Relay Commission in 1902, which notably had no Indian members initially until Syed Hussain Belgrami and Justice Gurudas Banerjee were added later. The act in 1904 was based on the recommendations of this commission. So now let's come on to the key provisions of the Act. The Act fundamentally changed the governance and the purpose of Indian universities. The research focus. Universities were no longer the examining bodies. They were now empowered to appoint their own professors and lecturers to promote the study and research. It reduced the Senate size, the number of fellows in the university senates were drastically reduced. The government gained the power to nominate the majority of these fellows, ensuring British control over decision making. They followed stricter affiliation rules. The conditions for private college to be affiliated with the university became much tougher. Universities were given the right to inspect colleges regularly to ensure compliance. The veto power. The government reserved the right to veto any regulations passed by the university senate. It also makes amendments or pass its own regulations if the Senate failed to do so. Territorial limits. The Governor General was given the power to define the territorial limits of each university. The backlash. Why did the Indians oppose it? The act was finally met with fierce resistance from the Indian nationalists, including Gopal Krishna Gokhale, who also was called as a retrograde measure. He also called it the retrograde measure. The imperialization of education and limiting its growth and the lack of economy. So let's talk about the imperialization of education. Nationalists saw this act as an attempt to turn universities into government departments by controlling the Senate and affiliation. The British suppresses subversive political ideas and limiting its growth. So the strict affiliation rules made it difficult for the Indian-run private colleges to survive, which was seen as a way to limit the spread of education among the masses. Lack of autonomy. So, sorry, it's the lack of autonomy. The the act effectively ended the academic independence of institutions like Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras universities. So today, this is what we have gone through the initial contract, the initial contact between 1478 to 1600, and like I said, we were discussing about the period, which will be in length. In the next class, we will be discussing about mm, 1600 to 1857. And firstly, we wanted to go through all of it, beginning with how did it come about? How did we come to 1600? Let us go into the initial stages where the Portuguese Vasco da Gama arrived in Portugal. So that was what was the initial stream. Macaulay's Minute on Education. Talking about the Macaulay's Minute, Thomas Babington Macaulay argued that English education was to create a class of Indians, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste and opinions, and morals and intellect. And English became the medium of instruction in higher education, sidelining the vernacular languages. So, Wood's Dispatch, which is also known as the Magna Carta of Indian education, it emphasized promoting Western education and the knowledge of English. Establishing universities in Calcutta, Madras, Macaulay's Minute in 1835 advocated for the English as a medium of instruction and Western learning, while Wood's Dispatch, formalized in 1854 and expanded upon this, introduced a structured education system with vernacular languages in the primary education and English for higher education. Thirdly comes the emergence of English as a language of power. English was essential for government jobs and administrative roles. It became a symbol for social status and upward mobility. Impact on the Indian education and the Indian society. A new class of educated Indians emerged, leading to the rise of political and social reforms movement. Led to the political and social reform movement. English was facilitated communication across diverse linguistic regions. It also deepened the cultural divide between English educated elite and the masses. The, the legacy and impact of English education in India, the positive aspects were it enabled Indians to engage in global discourse, science and technology, fueled the movements for independence by uniting leaders through a common language. Criticism undermined the traditional education systems and local languages, and it promoted a sense of inferiority in the Indian culture. Tomorrow we will be considering about going through the overview of the specimens like the data, the extracts of Raja Manik Chand's letter colonial to Colonel Clive, and some of the records, how they used to write during the times, and how the language has evolved and changed in with time, how it has changed with time. So we have learned about the Charter Act and the power struggle. Queen Elizabeth signed the Charter Act on the last day of 1600, granting the East India Company monopoly of all English commerce and in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, except the territories that occupied the Portuguese and the Spaniards. From this small beginning, the company passed through many years of prosperity and adversity, and finally, by the middle of 18th century, it was strong enough to challenge the attempts of the French for domination of Indian subcontinent. The British had established powerful factories and trading centers in important places all along the coast, and these were organized under three presidencies, that is, Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. First, the Aryans, as I already mentioned, they came to India and the subcontinent and settled down there. The language was Sanskrit and the literary language, and it became the language of religion too. But Prakrits were used by the common people. The Muslims were invaders, and particularly during this early period, later they established kingdoms in the Indian subcontinent and part settlers and their languages, like Persian and Arabic. They did not take deep roots to India. Instead, Urdu, a new language, was born in the Indian subcontinent. After the discovery of the sea route to India, the Portuguese and the Dutch, the French and the British came to India only as traders. There was an intense power struggle among them to establish factories and expand their establishments in India. The East India Company, that's the EIC, was formed on the last day of 1600, and the British became more and more well established in India because of their superior trade policies and naval power in different parts of the world. Now let's talk about the charter renewal which happened in 1813. So let's refer to 1813, that's 2.4, which is the pre-transportation phase. And we'll be reviewing it again tomorrow with the next class about the pre-transportation of the charter renewal stage. What exactly is pre-transportation? Why do we need to learn about it? What happened during that point of time? And pre-transportation, it refers to the methods of the movement of carrying objects before the widespread of the use of wheels and wheeled vehicles. This includes using sledges, dragging objects, and utilizing animals carrying loads. Examples including human beings dragging sleds, using pack animals like donkeys and oxen, and employing water transport via boats and raft. The differences between the settler and the colonists. Examples of Indian subcontinent in history. In the term, in term of colonists, the settler both pertain to individuals involved in colonization, but they carry distinct meaning and implications, especially within the historical context of Indian subcontinent. Portuguese in Goa is a good example. The 16th to the 20th centuries, where the colonists, the Portuguese, the East is colonial rule in Goa, focusing the trade and spear of Christianity settler. Over the time, Portuguese settlers integrated with the local populations, leading to a unique Indo-Portuguese culture. This involved some aspects of the settler colonialism, uh, Adivasi displacement during the British rule colonists. The settler, a person who migrates with the intention of establishing a permanent residence, often forming new communities typically involves displacement or replacement of indigenous populations. Pastoralists, it means a farmer who breeds and takes care of animals. The Charter Act, when the law, the quote, I quote, when law crosses oceans, let them carry justice, not just governance. True reform empowers not just rules. Charter Act means the legal context is a formal written document that grants rights and privileges or authority to a person, group, or organization. It outlines the legal biases for an entity existence and operation. The Charter Acts, especially in 1813 and 1833, were passed by the British Parliament to regulate the East India Company's rule in India. While these acts introduced administrative and legal reforms, they often served as the British to the British interests. The, this quote suggests that when one nation governs another, the goal should be justice and empowerment, not just control. Real reform uplifts people, it touches. The Charter Acts were a series of four acts. That's in 1793, 1813, 1833, and 1853. They were passed by the British Parliament every 20 years to renew and regulate the East India Company's trade monopoly and administrative control in India. These marked the shift from commercial trading to administrative governance, ultimately paving the way for a direct crown rule. Let's review once again Macaulay's Minute on Indian Education. To teach is not to erase a culture, but to let the minds bloom their own soil with borrowed light. And explain Thomas Babington Macaulay's Minute in 1835 supported English education in India. It often at the cost of Indian languages and knowledge systems. The quote gently criticizes the imposition of foreign language while suggesting that knowledge can be shared, borrowed light, without destroying a culture. Education should help people grow while respecting their roots. Universities, the various universities were established. A university is not merely a produce of scholars, but it awakens souls to serve with insight, integrity, and compassion. The British established universities in India, example at Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras in 1857. mainly to produce civil servants. This quote highly highlights the deeper purpose of education, not just to pass exams or to get jobs, but to build character and serve society wisely and kindly. Thomas Babington Macaulay's Minute on Indian Education on February 2nd, 1835, advocated replacing traditional Indian education with the Western learning in English. It aimed to create a class of anglicized Indians who could serve as a cultural and administrative intermediaries, famously describing them as Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and intellect. The key aspects of Macaulay's Minute in 1835 was to promote the European literature and science, arguing that Indian learning, Arabic and Sanskrit, was inferior to Western knowledge. Key aspects. Let's continue it with the language policy. It started that English should be the sole medium of instruction for a higher education, that the public funds should be utilized only for this purpose. Background. It was written to resolve the debate between Orientalists who favored local languages and traditional educationists, and Anglicists who favored English education, ultimately leading to a win for the latter. And the result of it was Lord William Bentinck officially accepted the recommendations of March 17, 1835, leading the English Education Act of 1835. The impact was that it led the expansion of English schools with a government resolution in 1844 opening higher level government positions to English speaking education. To the actually to the Indians. And now we'll talk about the Great Mutiny of 1857, which was a rebellion that is often the cry of the unheard hearts. When wisdom walks with kindness, conflict gives way to change. The revolt of 1857 was a major uprising against the British rule which caused deep grievances. This court recognizes the rebellion as a sign that is caused with deep grievances. People were feeling when the people feel ignored or oppressed. It calls for empathy and understanding as the tools to prevent conflict and build better relationships. Education be for the latter, for the, must not be for the latter, but for the few. But a lamp for many, lighting paths with respect for every mind and soul. Again, I repeat, education must not be a ladder for few, but a lamp for many, lighting paths with respect for every mind and soul. Wood's dispatch aims to expand education in India, including primary, secondary, and university levels. However, it often favored the elite and English education. The course generally emphasizes that true education should be inclusive and uplifting, not selective and controlling. So we've gone through the Macaulay's Minute and we will review it again. And then the objectives were what we have learned today is to understand the historical phases and the power struggles that prevailed during the pre-transportation phase before 1600, and it also read and understand the history of India with particular references to the introduction of English in India, and to comprehend the multilingual and multicultural context in Indian subcontinent and the result of various invasions. Yeah. Okay. Now, talking about the Vedic literature, the Aryans, the early Aryans who had settled in the Indus Valley's civilization, the throne grew in numbers and spread towards the east and south. So, when we are talking about the Indus Valleys, the Aryans who settled in the Indus Valley civilization, what was it about? It was about the civilization which exists during the Aryan period and the kind of mm, that about talking about Harappa and Mohenjo-daro and the kind of life the people lived, what are the kind of foods they ate, what are the kind of things they used, the pottery which they prepared all by hands, and which still goes down in history. And if you can remember those beautiful days, the common bathrooms which were constructed, and it was a long process of urbanization of the Indian subcontinent pictured in the Vedic literature. The Punjab receded in importance of Madhya Desa, and became the holy land of the Hindus. And the culture of Aryans is strong, rich, and potentially and typically Indian. So, now talking about the Sanskrit literature, which contained the words like leading with drama, history, philosophy, grammar, astronomy, algebra, medicine, and jurisprudence. And some of the most important names was Kalidasa, Sakuntala, Meghaduta, and Subandhu, Vaspadhatha, Valmiki, Ramayana, Vaisya, the Mahabharata, the Panini, and Aryabhatta. Harsha was the last great Hindu emperor of northern India. He died in 647 AD after the death of the Grand Empire he had built collapsed and was split into the number of small kingdoms. They followed the, then followed a period of nearly 2 centuries of confusion. For 4 centuries, from 800 to 1200 AD, nearly all the kingdoms were governed by the Rajput families. They were torn by mutual jealousy and bitterness and were seldom at peace. Their perpetual feuds prevented their union and destroyed all chances of offering and united resistance by the Muslims and when they invaded the Indian subcontinent. The reports of some Arab merchants also about the fabulous wealth and luxuries of India excited the greed of the Arabs, and their repeated conquests were attempted upon to the coast of India. Their aim was to plunder and not settlement. The lure of plunder brought in many waves in the name of the Holy War, and raids were repeated. In 1001 AD, Sultan Muhammad crossed over to India. In 1017 AD, he started with a huge force to appear before Mathura. The great shrines were to believed to be there, and they have looted it and razed the ground and ransacked Somnath too. He returned to Ghazni with rich spoils. His successors did more or less the same. Only by 1200 AD, the Delhi Sultanate was established, and the history of Muslim progress in the Indian subcontinent can be divided into two periods. That is, the period of the conquest between the administrative experiment and the period of imperial glory, the achievements of Grand Mughals from Babur, who came down to rule between 1526 to 1530, and Aurangzeb, who ruled from 1658 to 1700. The Mughal dynasty ruled India. And then the Mughal Empire, the alien in its nature and organization, was regarded as the vast majority of the subjects and essentially a foreign empire, and hence, in spite of its Indian setting, it could not aspire such feelings of intense loyalty and patriotism roused the Rajputs and the Marathas. As a result, the Muslim rulers remained invaders and later became part settlers. Persians remained as the court language of the language and literature, and Arabic remained the language of their religion, and that is Islam. At the same time, the result of the interaction between the languages and the cultures in the Indian subcontinent, the new linguistic phenomena called Urdu was born. Word Urdu in Turkish means army or camp. The word and the name of the language came into vogue in the late 18th century. The language began to in Lahore with troops of Muhammad of Ghazni settled down there in 1627, and it began with it was called Punjabi with a mixture of Persian, and it spread to Delhi and intermixed with Hindi. The Urdu language represents the linguistic process by which the invaders gave up their own language in favor of the local speech and mixed two other languages. That is, Urdu was the language of the camp and most part of the subcontinent. The ornate part of the language came from Persian Arabic words and the daily idiom from Hindustani. So the Urdu language, which now is official language of Pakistan, is mostly used in the Indian subcontinent, and Urdu, the Perso-Arabic script, uses Devangari script. Then the basic vocabulary and the rules of grammar for Urdu and Hindi are similar. So we have studied about the Vasco da Gama arriving in India, and we are going through all of it tomorrow in our next lesson. Vasco da Gama discovered the new trade route in 1498. The immediate effect was the diversion of European trade with India from the central states to Europe and the maritime states of the Western Europe like Portugal, Spain, and other countries. First among the European nations were to intrude into the new field was Portugal. The Portuguese established a number of settlements near the Ceylon and Bombay coast. The Malabar coast was scene of the early activities, which it was halfway house between the rich spice producing regions in Ceylon, Malacca, and Spice Islands on the one hand, and Persian Gulf and Red Sea, East Africa on the other. So Queen Elizabeth signed the Charter Act of, on the last day of 1600, granting the East India Company the monopoly of English commerce, in Pacific Oceans, except the territories that occupied the Portuguese and the Spaniards. From the small beginning, the company passed through many years of prosperity and adversity, and finally, by the middle of the 18th century, it was strong enough to challenge the attempts of the French for the domination of the Indian subcontinent. The French, who were most serious rivals of the British, appeared long after the British. They floated a French East India Company and established the settlements in India. They had factories in Mahe, Kal- Kalarikal, and other places. But the French could not achieve appreciable success in India because the superior British enterprise on the influence of India and outside. Thank you.